Thank you for joining us on this week's episode of Hoyt's Bowhunting Whitetails. And today we're going to be talking about shooting, how to shoot a bow. There's a lot that goes into being prepared and being confident to take a shot at a deer. This was my first year of archery, so it was really a progression from where I started having never shot a bow before to being able to shoot and kill a deer this season.
Hoyt's Bowhunting Whitetails is brought to you by Redneck Blinds, Day 6 Arrows, Code of Silence Apparel, Hunt Stand Pro Whitetail, Fuse Accessories, and Hoyt.
Dad, do you want to talk a little bit about what you did and what went into getting me ready to shoot my first deer?
Yeah, I think the slant on this one's going to be really focused not just for beginners, but maybe leaning a little bit towards beginners, because Jordan had never shot a bow before. In fact, I'm not even sure that she'd drawn one prior to the first part of October. So we had a lot of ground to make up, and there's some really important fundamentals that go with that. And one of the things that we missed was getting the right size draw length, right length draw length. And you'd think that, given my history with shooting bows and how much time I've spent doing it, I would have got that right. But there's a way you can do that, putting your fist against the wall and measuring from the wall to the corner of your mouth. And it gave me the wrong number for some reason. So Jordan ended up with a bow that was 1 inch short on draw length. So we worked around that, but that's the first thing, is making sure that the bow fits you. And any good archery shop, any good dealer can help you with that. So moving on from that, really it came down to just mastering the physical part of drawing a bow. It took Jordan probably, I would say, at least 2 weeks of drawing first her mom's bow, and then the one that we got for her, it's the Hoyt Eclipse is what she's shooting. It's a short draw length bow that Hoyt's putting out that really focuses on women or men with shorter draw lengths. But anyway, it was a couple of weeks of shooting before she could even begin to try to shoot accurately. So you always want to keep that in mind, is that even when you're going into the season, the first couple of weeks of practice really doesn't have anything to do with accuracy. It just gets down to mastering the draw weight, getting the bow back comfortably, and so that was step number one. And then after that, we just progressed into a lot of the basics. But what did you think, I'll throw it back to you, but what did you think was the biggest challenge that you faced early on?
Right off the bat, it was going back to accuracy. You would ask me, is it shooting high? Is it shooting left, right? And I didn't know, because I wasn't accurate enough, and I wasn't confident enough in how still I was holding it and how high of a quality of shot I was even taking to know whether or not it was just user error or if the sight was actually off. So I think in the beginning I didn't even know how to answer that question when you would ask me, and it took a few weeks before I was confident enough in how still I was holding it and how good of a shot I was taking before we could really finalize that sight location.
Yeah, I think it took almost a whole month to get Jordan dialed in, where I felt like even at 15 yards she was competent, that we could go out there and feel good with a 15-yard shot. A lot of that had to do with just being shaky, not making the same shot every single time.
Right.
So
making sure that I was using the same form, holding the bow the same way, drawing it back to the same place. I made the mistake one day. I was lining it up with the wrong sight pin. I was using, because I was shooting it off of, I think, the middle one for some reason instead of the top one. I was like, why are all of my arrows going nowhere near where they're supposed to? And it's because I wasn't lining it up right. And some of those are just obvious mistakes, but there's still things to make sure that you're not doing when you're starting out with a bow and trying to get it accurately sighted in.
Yeah, I think that brings up a good point, is your technique doesn't have to be perfect. Like we were talking about golf earlier and how complex that is. Shooting a bow isn't super complex. So you don't have to be Like you don't have to have perfect form. It helps if you do, because some of the other things that will transfer better. But all you have to do is the same thing every single time. Even if it's wrong, if you're doing exactly the same thing every single time, you're going to shoot pretty well. So that's where I think the early on in the process was just gaining that consistency. And it starts with the grip, and we'll talk about that real quick, and we'll kind of move through the shot. But we could be here for a whole hour talking about shooting a bow if we don't kind of jump through some of it. But like when you're gripping a bow, it has to be the same every single time. And ideally, what you're doing is you're lining up your forearm, the bones in your forearm, with the pressure point where the grip is pushing against your hand, because then you don't have a hinge. Like if you look at it, I'm going to get where you can see this maybe. If you're off center from that and you start pushing, then your wrist becomes a hinge. Either it's hinging in or it's hinging out, depending on which side of that point you're pushing on. So ideally, you don't have a hinge there. So it's just little stuff like that where you get the bow pushing into the same spot on your hand every single time when you draw it back. Like, do you grip it? Do you shoot relaxed? How do you hold the bow? So making sure that you do even those simple things the same every single time, because if you grip it different, it's going to shoot different. And that's probably the most critical single part of consistency, is how you grip the bow. And I think that was something that you learned too, was you had to be super consistent with where it was at in your hand when you started to draw.
Yeah, another issue that I had early on was gripping it too tight, and it created too much tension almost. And so when I relaxed my grip on the bow and let it rest in my hand more instead of gripping it, it was easier to make a consistently accurate shot, because there wasn't as much variation in how tightly I was gripping it, if I was gripping it in or out, whatever. If it was always just resting in your hand and you're bracing it against it instead of gripping onto it, you can do that the same way every time, a lot easier than using the same amount of grip pressure.
Yeah, and I think the main thing in that is relaxation. Because it's really hard to aim and keep the bow steady if you're tense. And I feel like a lot of the tension starts in your hand, and it starts in your feet, believe it or not. It starts in your grip hand and your feet. If you relax your feet and you relax your grip hand, it's kind of weird that those two things have a way of kind of smoothing out the whole rest of your body.
Sort of like when you're running, if you tend to tense up, if you relax your jaw, it helps the whole rest of your body relax too.
Yeah,
I wonder if it's the same for hunting.
Yeah, it's about relaxation. To shoot, consistently, you want that aiming point or that pin to not be moving around a lot, and the more relaxed you are, the more it settles. So really, I think that was a key point. I think, what else? What other things did you think were a big part of your transition?
I've noticed it now that we got the longer draw length on my bow, but when it was too short, I wasn't able to pull it back all the way and kind of lock my arm in at that full draw position. When you have it set right, you get to that point and you don't have to constantly brace.
Right.
It locks, and it's easier to hold it at full draw.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think two more things that I think are super critical too, for especially beginners, but really anybody. And one is the bow arm. I think that you did a really good job of that. I felt like, of holding the shot, holding the bow arm at the target until the arrow hit. And I feel like that's a simple way that you can create a lot more consistency, even if the rest of your form isn't perfect. Because if your bow's not moving, like you shoot, and the arm is still aiming at the target when the arrow hits it, there's a pretty good chance that you didn't do very much in front of that to throw it off. Because the old saying is that whatever you're doing right after the arrow leaves the bow is what you're starting to do while the arrow was still on the bow. So as long as you can focus on keeping your aim and keeping your arm and your mental focus on that spot until the arrow hits, I thought you did a really nice job. I think that's what sort of saved your season. I think was your ability to do that.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and then the other one is just how you approach the trigger. Like learning to squeeze the shot rather than punching it.
Yep.
I think that's super important.
Similar principle that I learned gun hunting growing up. Gun hunting, it isn't a punch of the trigger, it was a squeeze. I remember you saying when I was younger, it should almost catch you off guard a little bit when the trigger when the gun goes off, or in this case probably when the arrow leaves the bow, because you want it to be such a slow squeeze instead of just a punch.
Right. If you're commanding it, you can get what's called target panic, and we'll come back and talk about how to cure target panic. I've got a lot of stuff that you can do there, including some release aids that we're using that will help you do that. But target panic is when you start anticipating and the pin gets close to the spot and you're like trying, like it's almost like a mental, well, it is a mental disconnect. You're telling yourself now, and it's like, you can never quite get comfortable with the pin stopping, so you're always, trying to give that command. Well, if you're not doing that, if you're just floating the pin around the spot you're trying to hit, even if it's not dead still, and then you're squeezing at the same time and then the shot goes, you almost always get a better result than if you're commanding it.
That makes sense.
So those are the key points. You can get into a lot of stuff on stance and positioning, and Jordan struggled a little bit with that because she had a little bit of back lean when she first started, but over time she got better at that. It should just be a normal stance, like a normal upright position. The bow's at a 90-degree angle, or your bow arm's at a 90-degree angle to your upper body. You're not leaning back into it or trying to figure out some way to compensate for either a lack of strength or just a lack of comfort or whatever. So I felt like that part you really got better at as time went along. But no, Jordan was, by the end, she was making really good 20-yard shots. I didn't feel like we had anything to worry about when the deer showed up. And
it's coming from someone who squinted the wrong eye the first time she ever shot a bow, so there was really nowhere to go but up from that first time.
Yeah, when you're right eye dominant and you're closing your right eye and you're shooting right-handed, that's not going to work. No, so it just shows, I guess, the thing to take away is that, with a little bit of focus and maybe some help, there's people out there that will help you. You can go from not knowing anything to being game ready within a month if you just keep to conservative shots. 15 yards. Then I felt like by the very end, by the time the season was over, you were probably good to 20.
Yeah.
So I think we may come back again with another one of these. It's fun to hear what Jordan has to say about her progress. I don't know, we probably are pushing our time limit on this unless you've got some more thoughts of things that you learned shooting the bow. I feel like there's tons and tons of stuff we can focus on and talk about, like how to shoot,
Oh, yeah.
Like where your elbow should be pointing at full draw, how you should pull, all these little subtle things that the top experts know. Do you hold your breath? Do you breathe in? Do you breathe out? What do you do? How long do you hold at full draw before you let down because your concentration is starting to lapse? Those are all like fine tuning. But what Jordan learned in 1 month is enough for almost everybody to be, ready for the hunt in just a month's time and be good to 15 yards.
The last thing that I'd probably say is how I underestimated how different it feels shooting at a target in the yard versus shooting even practice arrows from a blind or from a tree, let alone when there's a deer in front of you. But it's pretty easy to just stand flat-footed and shoot at a 15-yard target, but as soon as you introduce variables like the height of the stand, having a smaller platform, shooting out of blind windows, those are all situational things that it's definitely worth practicing those before the time comes to actually take a shot, because they have a bigger impact than I had expected them on your comfort and confidence level.
Yeah, and I think that was another thing that you did that was really, really good, and that was having the 3 practice arrows. So every time we got to the blind or to the tree, Jordan would take 3 shots in the directions where she thought deer would come. So we would try to anticipate, like, if there's going to be one here, how are you going to handle it? And then she would go through those, those shots and just try to get comfortable with what it's going to really feel like in the tree. I think that's super important. I think even for somebody like myself, after all these years, that's still a good practice. Have that extra arrow when you get in there. Just take 1 shot just to sort of break the ice, get you back in that more aggressive mindset.
And it also, even if it would have just been aiming, a practice aim, and there was no arrow to shoot, having to think about it and look through the sight from those different locations helps you identify, okay, here's where my windows are, here's where, if the deer is here, this is how I'm gonna stand, and this is gonna be the most comfortable position to make this shot in. And it really went a long ways in helping me feel prepared when I actually came time to make the shot.
And I think that'll be a really important factor this coming season, because this season I'm going to hunt separately most of the time from Jordan. We're going to try to have another camera person to join us that can be with Jordan, and that way she can kind of do her own thing and create her own path, and I can hunt the spots that I want to hunt, and she can sleep in and do whatever.
You can go sleep in the ditch or sleep in the drainage tube or the haunted shack.
I don't know about that haunted shack, but I think the rest of it's a go. So that's like I said, we'll keep touching base on shooting and some of the finer points, but we just thought that it'd be fun to produce an episode on shooting a bow for beginners. What are the handful of things that are super critical? If you get these things right, you're 75 to 80% of the way there. And I think we hopefully covered that. So we appreciate you joining us this week. We'll see you right back here again next week for the next episode of Hoyt's Bowhunting Whitetails.
And remember to always dream big.